Hello and welcome back to Talking Leadership TV. This podcast continues our discussions with Brendan Logue from the Advisory Board Centre. In particular, I spoke with Brendan about the 2023 MEGATRENDS Summit and some key issues that were discussed, including sustainability from an environmental and social governance perspective, issues facing governance boards, and the stakeholder economy. Again, thank you for joining us. I will also put a link to the State of the Market Global Report 2023 that was released by the Advisory Board Centre on Tuesday, 6th of June. Thanks again for joining us, but enough from me. I'll hand over to Brendan. You were involved with a Megatrends conference discussion in early May this year. Yep. And I want to talk about that and some implications from a leadership perspective. So we'll get to the first of three themed areas I'd like to talk to you about. The first is sustainability. So you talked about that in a certain context. So can you give us some broader detail about what that was at the conference?
Happy to, Eric. And I was fortunate enough to chair a panel with members of our community. So I might just explain the community first and then get to the question, the topic at hand. Our community is a distributed network of independent professionals who choose advisory boards and governance boards as part of what they do. The majority choose a portfolio approach to work rather than just having the typical corporate day job or perhaps entrepreneurial pursuit now. So they're board level contributors. But with that context set, every year we bring our members together. This year it was in Brisbane. One of those themes that you've alluded to was sustainability. As a subset, if you like, of that was a focus on environmental and social governance, which is a theme that will be very well known, I would expect, by your audience, specifically those in the corporate sphere, because what's coming down the pipe, no matter really where you are geographically speaking, are some expectations in that space. So I was fortunate enough to interview some global leaders on that panel, one of whom was the current chair of Energy Queensland, for instance, the people that keep the lights on here in our Sunshine State in Queensland. The other member of that panel is based in Hong Kong, but she serves a number of traditional, you would call them, energy companies, both in the Asia Pacific region, developed and developing countries. So it's interesting to get that perspective from Sarah Fairhurst's viewpoint. The last one, Paul Hodgson, he's a gentleman who is the chair of Manufacturing Institute of Australia, and so from a who consumes energy perspective, that's an area that was of great interest to the broader community, who are representative of, business and industry leaders themselves. The key takeaways I took from that conversation, if I may, was it's complex. It's the ESG top-down approach as far as challenging organizations from accessing insurance, financial services in some cases, is proving to be a real issue in developing markets. So Sarah Fairhurst was very forthcoming with an example or a couple of examples that she provided where these power generation companies that she sits on their boards were struggling to find insurers and, in some cases, financiers to support their legitimate, desire to stay in business. So it's interesting how ESG is impacting different parts of the industry paradigm in different ways. But it's coming to a to a supply chain near you. It's certainly hitting the consumers here in Australia and around the world in the hip pocket, and it doesn't look like it will abate anytime soon.
Let's go to that social governance idea of what you just talked about. Energy development. Now, I'm going to throw maybe a Hail Mary here and see how you go with this one.
Let's see how we go,
yeah. When we talk about energy development, particularly in the first world context, we're talking Australia here in particular, there are going to be winners and losers from that process as we transform an economy from fossil-based fuel energy sources to renewables. And one thing I wanted to ask was a discussion, or was a point brought up at all around the divide between urban and rural Australia in terms of energy production? Because I'm hearing that in other contexts that I work. I just thought it interesting to ask you that, because when you said at the start, it's complex, I thought, yeah, that's not understating it. It is extremely complex. So have you got any thoughts on that, or was that a topic that was discussed at all at the conference?
It was, and it came from the floor from a primary producer who was an early adopter of solar, for instance, on some of his cattle feedlots and sheds. But where his properties are, there are no transmission lines, right? And so if it's not solar, it's a diesel genset. And so you have this even within a developed country such as Australia, given our size, it just makes no commercial sense for an energy distributor to build a set of poles and wires that go out to where a bunch of Australians have their businesses and choose to live. So yes, my sense is in the urban centres, and my sense secondhand in this case, because this came firsthand from the chair of Energy Queensland, was we will continue to have the haves and the have-nots, who the haves in centralised urban cities will enjoy the ability to pick and choose, because there is an abundance of, well, options available to them, and there is the density for them to be able to select, yeah, I'll just stay on the grid or go off grid if that's what they so choose, have an EV, what have you. The challenge is for Sarah Zelko and for those in that industry is, well, what do you do for those who are in Cloncurry, and for those who are in Mount Isa, and for those who are industry players in those mineral settings? Because building some poles and wires out as far as that is very, very expensive. So the suggestion is maybe there's some middle ground where microgrids are set up. It's really interesting. It probably won't be considered here under this government, but from an energy policy standpoint, in other distributed energy demanding economies such as Canada, for instance, they're putting small scale modular style nuclear reactors, the size of which may well fit into a 40-foot container, for instance, which is just wild to think about. It's an incredible progression from where they've come from as a source of energy. It's a little way off, it's still being proven, but that is something that I would hope we in Australia can work towards, because, well, it's clean, it's safe, it's reliable, and it exists.
We need to be as pragmatic as we can be, realizing that there's a global shift to doing something different about our energy mix. I get that is the discussion, but there's still that transition phase, and I think it's in that transition phase that we get the hiccups that we see about who wins and who loses, and are those that lose in that process actually being considered when the rollout of these things is happening. And I think it's not done intentionally, but the unintended consequences around energy policy have existed for quite some time, and I don't think it's an easy fix, because if it was, it would have been done by now. And when you talk about geographical issues, Australia is a big place, and I get that investments in particular, not just the energy generation source, but the transmission source, is governments don't want to, I think by and large, and this is just an observation, don't want to be the energy investor of last resort. They want the market to do something about it. And maybe investing in that uber expensive infrastructure discussion is something that most don't want to delve into at the moment. But that's interesting that was one of the top topic areas, Brendan. Now, the other one I wanted to talk to you about, you mentioned governance and governance from the perspective of governance and in that space, advisory board. So can you unpack that a little bit for us as well, please?
Sure. And so as part of our summit was the launch of, to our members at least, the latest State of the Market report, the highlights of which I'll touch on in a moment, and more than happy to share that report, which will be released just before this podcast will go live. So your members will be one of the your subscribers or listeners will be the first to review that in many cases. But what was spoken about, which was really interesting and a consequential shift from previous periods where we've done this research analysis and drawn out some insights, is that increasingly governance boards are constrained, and the list of expectations on their table only growing. And if I can provide some unsurprising examples of what I mean by that, when you think about the nature of who tends to sit around a governance board, they are seasoned corporate executive leaders who may well be the other side of their corporate contribution, right? They now want to pick and choose who they work with, and for good reason. They hold fiduciary and legal responsibility for that organisation, right? And so Optus, they failed in an area as it related to looking after their customers' data. So cyber risk. That's probably the most public example in recent times, where it's clear that governance board were ill-equipped to cope with the specific and quite narrow demands in that particular domain. The other ones which are emerging and coming down the pipe really quickly are the accelerated adoption of AI. And let's face it, there are very, very few people who actually know what they're talking about in that space. So the implications for just about every business who are in a service industry, which is just about every business here in Australia, are tremendous. And if they don't know the right questions to ask, or if those people around that governance board table have never seen, touched, or heard of this stuff before, they're exposed. Other elements such as ESG, which kind of flows on from our last conversation. Again, this is an emerging expectation that you need to be current in terms of being able to respond. And so what does this mean at an aggregate level? There's a greater degree of complexity and volatility, and an accelerated fashion. So what are organizations doing? And this is kind of the intersection between governance boards and advisory boards, is they're choosing to put risky conversations that they're ill-equipped at having because they don't know the right questions to ask nor who to ask them to, is they're putting them elsewhere. They're putting them in a fit-for-purpose advisory boards that being chaired by somebody who knows what they're talking about, and seeking from that advisory board options that they can still maintain responsibility for. So give us an A or B tends to be a reasonable outcome, recognising that the 15 options that they might be required to consider, they're ill-equipped to even start to consider. And so the emergence of governance systems where there's certainly a governance boards that being maintained, but where they're putting specific challenging conversations as it relates to those themes and many others, market entries, acquisition, now that finance costs something again, where do we get capital? All of these kind of consequential strategy level conversations that require attention of deep specialists either it's a McKinsey's or a Bain conversation, or maybe it's an advisory board conversation if you don't want to go down the 12-month, 18-month consulting route.
Kind of a couple of questions that come to mind from there. So,
Go for it.
yeah, so the governance space, is an interesting one for me in that I've worked with and been on boards. I've seen some very good operators at the board level, and the boards that I've seen function the best know what they don't know and will outsource to get information in, whether or not they go to an advisory board or set up. In some places, I see them as committees, but they're still part of the business. I think when you're talking advisory board, you're talking separate to the business, giving the business advice, or are you talking advisory boards that are implemented within the business? That's a distinction I wasn't quite clear about. Or is there some hybrid of both that tend to operate out there?
That's what the business is trying to achieve naturally. So, in the example of an advisory board being set up for cyber risk assurance purposes, they will certainly have their chief technology representative there, probably a member of the governance board as a conduit to the governance board, represented in that advisory board or committee or think tank. In some cases, they refer to them as. But then you'll have independent experts whose capability is not represented in the organisation, right? So you can only carry so many deep specialists. Depending on the scale of your business, you can only carry so many of them. And so where people do this as part of what they do for a living, they go really deep. And so the necessity to do that and seek assurance in this instance, if it's cyber risk assurance, it is evident that you would need internal representatives whose responsibility is to maintain the decision-making role and execute it on the behalf of the CIO or CTO. But you also need perspective beyond those four walls, because what's best practice? If you've worked in that organization for 10 years as the CIO, I'm sorry, but you don't actually know what's happening elsewhere to the degree that you should. And so from a risk profile, you're putting risky conversations elsewhere and seeking assurance from others who are those depth experts in their specific domain. If we continue that cyber risk thing. The other thing, if we change the scale of market or the scale of business that we're referring to, there's a whole bunch of, in the business sector now, privately held businesses who are going through some succession planning challenges. And so what do we do with this business? Are we going to carve it up to the next generation? Are we going to sell it and then divvy up the cash? Or does somebody want to take it on, and how will that work? So there's all sorts of very emotive conversations that are going on within, in some cases, some very sophisticated family businesses, because from a demographic standpoint here in Australia, a good chunk of those boomers they're thinking about, if they're not already doing it, they're thinking about where's my exit and how might that best be affected, which is a key demand area for advisory boards in the business sector.
Are we morphing over time away from traditional boards to something else, or do we have no other model other than a board at this stage? Because I understand the difference, and you've explained this a few times around the difference between an advisory board and a standard governance board, but are our boards fit for purpose? Is it something that needs to change over time? Is anyone challenging the paradigm, or is it the best that we can do given the complexity of the business world?
Yeah, good question. And I would say that I don't know anybody through this community, and we've got 580 board professionals in 25 countries. It's a curated community, and so maybe that's the reasoning for my landing point. I don't know anybody who doesn't recognize that how things are running now may not be how things will look in the future, but they're curious. They are humble enough to recognize that, as you say, they don't know everything. And so whether it is additional seats to the board, or perhaps carving out an agenda for which the governance board is responsible for and is confident executing, decisions being made, right? Governance itself. And then putting these more creative risk-on style conversations elsewhere, whether that be in, consulting houses for support, whether that be in think tank type models if they're engaging their customers, maybe, or whether that be in formalized structured advisory boards for which they're seeking, perspective beyond what they already know from those who are independent of them. So they're not afraid of, of the there's no conflict between people sticking their neck out, right? And I think so. What have governance boards allowed us as a society to do? We have a more prosperous outcome. We live longer by something like 50%. So by all metrics, our society is going in the right direction. The trend suggests if you continue, we're going on the right direction. So I don't think there is a need to overhaul governance and throw it out in kind of a radical sense. My sense is that there will likely be, where necessary, where businesses have to change and adapt to market conditions, that they not just expect that to come from the board and or the CEO, that there are other options available to them, and those people have, well, they might not have seen the exact circumstance, but it certainly rhymes with what they have seen elsewhere.
That's amazingly interesting insight. I hadn't thought about it that way, but perhaps the future of boards is that the charter of a board becomes a bit more flexible to take in the things that you're talking about, to as you recruit people to boards, that the board won't know every damn thing because no human can know that, but it's to have the tools and the capability within that board to outsource and have some other discussions in other contexts through the use of, say, advisory committees, boards, think tanks, to help them be better decision makers. That's interesting to me, and that and I wasn't for a minute suggesting we need to get rid of boards altogether. I'm just one that likes to think a few steps ahead, and boards have been around for longer than I've been and will be into the future, but everything gets challenged. I think that's worth challenging, and the conversation around how can boards do their jobs better is, I think, a fruitful discussion to have. Your community wouldn't exist if that's something that they weren't actively thinking about, to the degree that I'm not an advocate for getting rid of boards altogether, because you need someone to ensure that there's some transparency in decision making, that there's that the eye on that, if I can use an antiquated term, that triple bottom line, so social, economic, and environmental. You need boards for that, so cannot disagree with you there. Look, Brendan, the last area I'd like to talk to you about is, you coined this phrase before we had the discussion. I'm interested to unpack this, that stakeholder economy. Can you talk a bit about that and what was discussed at the conference for us?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I mean, this is another big topic, like ESG, right? That thanks to the advancements of technology, and I think the consumer shift in expectations and their ability to really impact positively or negatively your business, you could argue has never been it's never been more consequential that each consumer or each customer or each stakeholder be given a good experience, right? And so I think in that, with that kind of being accepted, what we were talking about was actually in the paradigm of sport. So Brisbane 2032, we will host the Olympic Games, the Summer Olympic Games, which I, as somebody who has a real passion for sport and a leader of a community sporting organisation, I'm tremendously excited about, because I think about, well, will members of our community be represented at that games. And wouldn't that be just an amazing thing for me to share with my kids, for instance? And it's like, this is where you could be. So in the stakeholder economy space, what we unpacked was, well, what do members of the community, say the customers of, if Brisbane was a business, or if Brisbane, the ratepayers were your customers, are we meeting their expectations as far as what's coming? And maybe, if we introduce a theme such as legacy, which is always spoken about around the games, what if we were to bring forward legacy? So instead of waiting for legacy to happen after the fact, let's bring forward legacy as it relates to infrastructure, for instance, and the promotion of sport as a means to develop, individuals, but also how individuals work within organizations and systems. As we think about what we've come through during the COVID years in particular, where we became a far more fractured and inward-facing, individual-focused society, I think this holds so much hope, as well as risk for those businesses who are involved in serving, which is just about every business, or at least 80% of businesses around Australia. We're a service-based economy now. So the consideration for not only my customers, not only my shareholders, but how my brand is perceived, and the power of people who I don't really have all that much to do with is evident, and it is both an opportunity and a risk for those who understand it.
Something I drew from your response there was around the business and those providing services in a service-based economy, like you're saying that Australia is. That what kind of citizen are we in that space? I think that's kind of what you're getting at there. And when you talk about bringing legacies forward, I hadn't heard of that as a concept. So yeah, you think after a games, for me, I'm a World Cup soccer tragic. So for me, if we can get a World Cup in Brisbane,
well, the girls are coming here soon, man. There's one happening just around the corner.
Yeah. So again, that around that, not just paying it forwards but paying it backwards is an interesting concept. That building that infrastructure, the things that we need that will provide that legacy well after the games is quite an interesting space to play in. Brendan, look, thank you for going through some of what was touched on in your conference. Obviously, there were some very fruitful conversations, and I'd want to ask you, just to conclude the discussion here, your overall sense of what was presented at the conference from a leader perspective. If you were in that audience, so I'll get you to pitch yourself not as facilitating in one of the discussions, but you're out in the audience. What would be your key takeaways from that from the event?
People choose to get involved within our community who share an optimistic outlook. The currency of a good advisory board, and so therefore a good contributor to an advisory board, is intelligence that can be actionable to the recipient of that advice. So if I may share the overwhelming takeaway for me was a sense of optimism in spite of what appears to be a more rapidly evolving landscape for businesses and their leaders. And so just to, I guess, throw a stat in there to kind of point to the increase that we're observing for demand and those contributing to advisory boards. Over the last 3 years, we've seen about a 2.6 million increase. Now, those are professionals who are contributing to advisory boards. 2.6 million more people are contributing to advisory boards than 3 years ago, which is just an astonishing statistic. The challenge for us as the Advisory Board Centre is, in many ways, and this is observable from our past research, they're making it up as they go along. And so us as the standard bearer, we've got some work to do to get across, even if it is a small fraction of those, to build capability and understanding such that their contribution is ethical, measurable, and repeatable. And so if we build the sector's reputation, in essence, that's our role, is to help buttress and create a new sector which is rapidly growing, to ensure that they have an assessment or an understanding of what good looks like. Seems a worthy cause, and I've certainly, and my team and members of the organisation have our work cut out for us.
Thank you for joining us again, Brendan. I'll make available links to your work and what you've been doing, and I'll put a link to the outlook,
the state of the market report.
The state of the market report. Sorry, that
Thanks,
you said
Eric.
you'd make available. Yeah, I'd love people to have a look at it. And thank you again for your time, mate.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Thanks again for joining us. We've been speaking with Brendan Logue from the Advisory Board Centre. As always, thank you for following the podcast. Please drop a like or subscribe to help the channel grow. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Talking Leadership TV.